The wind slid along the stained glass windows like a fingertip looking for a weak point. Before we begin, understand this: some secrets don't destroy marriages. They reveal them. If you believe real strength is measured by loyalty under pressure, subscribe now and stay with this story until the very end. Because tonight, you're not just watching a scandal unfold, you're witnessing the moment a man chooses integrity over image. Even the portraits felt different after dark, their eyes catching candlelight in ways that made me wonder what they'd seen before I ever earned the right to live here. I used to find comfort in that. Weight meant permanence. Permanence meant control. That was the story I told myself as I walked these corridors with the title people like to say out loud, Lord Adrian Caldwell, as if it explained everything about me. I was a man with an estate in Vermont and a second property on the Maine coast, a man with a name that opened doors and silenced questions. Most days, I believed I'd built something untouchable. And in the center of it all was Evelyn. In public, she was what people expected me to choose: graceful, measured, impossibly composed. The kind of woman who could stand under chandeliers at charity galas and make every person in the room feel like they were being seen, even when she barely spoke. She wore silence the way other women wore diamonds. I remember an older donor once leaning toward me after an equestrian benefit, his breath heavy with bourbon and entitlement. "She's refined," he'd said, as if complimenting a horse. "Not like the others. You know what I mean?" I didn't know what he meant. He was the kind of man who said refined when he meant safe. The kind of man who needed everyone in his orbit to match a certain look, a certain pedigree. I'd given him the polite smile expected of me, but Evelyn's eyes had drifted toward him for half a second, cool, distant, and sharp enough that he looked away first. Later that night, when we were alone in the car, I'd asked, "Did he offend you?" She'd kept her gaze on the window. "He offended himself," she said, softly. Men like that don't notice how small they sound." I should have realized then that Evelyn's silence wasn't softness. It was restraint. Still, the marriage we displayed to the world looked ceremonial and unbreakable. We hosted the dinners, shook the hands, smiled for the foundation photographs. We acted like two people who had always belonged in the same frame. I let myself believe the calm was proof of happiness. But I've always been trained to watch details. Lenny teaches you that. Money teaches you that. Reputation teaches you that more than anything. A man can lose everything because he missed a single crack in the foundation. And slowly, beneath Evelyn's composure, I began to feel the crack. It wasn't one dramatic change. It was the accumulation of small absences, moments that didn't match the person I thought I knew. Locked drawers in her study that she never used to lock. Letters she didn't mail, only held, like they burned her fingers. Late night walks she took alone on the grounds, wrapped in a coat I hadn't seen before, moving like she was trying not to leave footprints. A distant expression whenever the subject of children came up, as if the very word dragged her somewhere she didn't want to go. I offered her space at first. I told myself this was grief. Evelyn had lost both parents young, and loss doesn't always behave like people think it should. It doesn't announce itself. It returns quietly, like a draft in a closed room. One night, I found her in the conservatory after midnight. The moonlight turned the glass ceiling into a pale mirror. She stood among dormant orchids, her hands folded tight, her shoulders lifted in a way that looked like bracing. "Evelyn," I said, keeping my voice low, as if the house might overhear. "You should be asleep." "I couldn't," she answered, still facing the windows. I stepped closer. Her lips twitched, not quite a smile. "No." "Then tell me what's wrong." The silence between us stretched until it felt physical. Finally, she said, "Do you ever feel like the safest place in the world is still temporary?" The question landed in me like something heavy. I watched her reflection in the glass, her eyes not on the estate grounds, but on something farther away. "You're safe here," I said. "With me." She turned then, just enough that I could see the strain she tried to hide behind composure. "That's what scares me," she whispered. How much I want to believe it. I should have pressed her. But something in me, pride, fear, the habit of letting people keep their masks, held me back. I told myself she would speak when she was ready. The next evening, I sat alone in the library with estate accounts spread across the desk. The fire hissed and settled. My pen moved through columns with the calm of routine. Numbers didn't lie. Numbers didn't hesitate. Until they did. A transfer sat in the ledger like a stain. One of my private trust's Caldwell legacy holdings had been used for a payment I did not authorize. The amount wasn't catastrophic, but it was too precise to be an error. And when I traced the transaction history, my stomach tightened. It wasn't a single payment. It was recurring. Monthly, for nearly 3 years. I stared at the authorization code, expecting to see my signature identifier. Instead, I saw hers. Evelyn's digital approval, routed through an account she was never supposed to access. I told myself there had to be an explanation. A bookkeeping misunderstanding. A forgotten arrangement. Anything. But then my eyes caught the memo line attached to the transaction. Not a normal description. Not a vendor name. Just 2 words, typed like a warning. Keep her hidden. My hand went cold on the paper. In that moment, I realized I wasn't looking at charity or vanity or even betrayal. I was looking at fear organized, funded, and carefully concealed inside my own house. Behind me, the library door creaked. I didn't turn fast. I didn't want to reveal what I'd found. But when I looked up, Evelyn stood in the doorway, watching me with expression I'd never seen on her before. Not guilt, not anger. Recognition. Like she knew exactly what I was holding. Her eyes flicked to the open ledger, then back to my face, and in the quiet between us, I understood something terrifying she hadn't been hiding from me. She'd been hiding me. And before I could speak, she said one sentence that made the entire manor feel like a trapedrian. If you follow that money, you won't just learn my secret. You'll learn what they did to make sure no one believes me. Evelyn's words did not echo in the library after she spoke them. They settled. Heavy. Permanent. If you follow that money, you won't just learn my secret. You'll learn what they did to make sure no one believes me. She left before I could answer. Not dramatically. Not in panic. She simply closed the door with the quiet precision she used for everything. The fire continued to burn. The ledger remained open. And I understood that whatever I was about to uncover had already been weighing on her for years. I did not confront her again that night. Power, I had learned, was most effective when exercised quietly. Noise alerted enemies. Silence built advantage. By morning, I had contacted an external forensic accounting firm, one that did not report to the Caldwell Foundation Board. I authorized a discreet review of every transfer routed through the trust account in question. I did not inform Evelyn. Not because I doubted her, but because I sensed she had spent years navigating something fragile. I needed facts before emotion. The results arrived in 48 hours. The funds were directed to a facility in upstate New York, listed in documentation as a private residential care home. No public website. No state marketing footprint. No affiliation with hospital systems or recognizable charities. The incorporation paperwork was intentionally minimal. The deeper breakdown disturbed me more than the destination. Monthly operational payments. Medical supply reimbursements. Private transportation services booked under rotating aliases. Confidential legal retainers tied to sealed cases. This was not a vanity charity. It was infrastructure. Evelyn had been funding something or someone for nearly 3 years. I left Blackthorn Manor without telling her where I was going. I did not want her to feel pursued. I told her I had business in Albany. She studied my face longer than usual before nodding. "Be careful," she said quietly. The drive north grew lonelier as the highway thinned into 2-lane roads surrounded by skeletal trees. The GPS eventually directed me down a narrow gravel stretch that felt intentionally forgettable. No signage, no identifying marker. The building emerged from behind a cluster of pines, rectangular, muted, built for function rather than welcome. It was not a mansion. It was not even comfortable. It looked like a place that did not want to be noticed. Security cameras tracked my vehicle before I reached the entrance. Inside, the air smelled sterile. A woman in her late 50s stood behind a reinforced reception window. Her eyes assessed me without warmth. "We don't accept visitors," she said flatly. "My name is Adrian Caldwell." Her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. "I'm aware," she replied. "That doesn't change policy." I slid a folder across the counter documentation of the trust payments, the authorization signatures. "It should." Her eyes flicked down. When she looked back up, something in her expression changed from resistance to calculation. "You weren't supposed to come here," she said. Was I supposed to fund it blindly? Silence lingered between us. Finally, she pressed a button beneath the desk. A door unlocked with a mechanical click. "What you see stays protected," she said. "These women don't need another man thinking he understands their suffering." The word man carried weight. Accusation without raising her voice. "I'm not here to dominate," I said carefully. "I'm here to understand." She studied me for a long moment, then stepped aside. The hallway beyond was dim and narrow. Reinforced doors lined one side. Through small observation windows, I caught glimpses of lives suspended in recovery. A young woman seated on a bed, arms wrapped around herself, staring at nothing. Another speaking softly with a therapist, flinching at sudden movement. One restrained not violently, but protectively, her wrists loosely secured to prevent self-harm. Their files rested in coded binders at a nurse's station. I did not touch them at first. I only read the visible labels. Severe psychological trauma. Court, protected identity. Domestic threat level extreme. Witness relocation candidate. This was not a hospital. It was a sanctuary, a shield. And Evelyn had been financing it in complete silence. Most of them were married into influence. The director said quietly behind me, "Political families, corporate dynasties, communities that care more about reputation than truth." There it was. Not physical violence described in detail, but social violence. Character assassination. Gaslighting at scale. Women declared unstable when they resisted control. Powerful men rewrite narratives. She continued. They call their wives hysterical, emotional, unstable. They question their sanity until the world questions it too. The words tightened something inside me. "Who protects them?" I asked. "We do," she said, "when someone is brave enough to fund us." I turned toward the nurse's station. A single intake binder lay slightly separated from the rest. My eyes caught the name before I consciously decided to look. Evelyn Hart, not Caldwell. Hart. Dated 12 years ago. My breath stopped. The pages beneath her name were thick legal documents, psychiatric evaluations, relocation records. The intake summary described her as high risk, credible threat, reputational attack pending. She arrived under protective referral, the director said softly. Engaged to a very powerful man. When she tried to leave, he made sure everyone believed she was unstable. The room felt smaller. She never spoke publicly. The director continued. But she survived. And when she did, she made a promise. What promise? I managed. That if she ever had power of her own, she would build a door for the next woman. The twist struck harder than I expected. Evelyn hadn't been hiding weakness. She had been building an escape network. But something else caught my attention at the bottom of the intake page. A notation added 6 months ago. Threat assessment reactivated. I looked at the director. What does that mean? She held my gaze steadily. It means the man who tried to erase her is asking questions again. And in that moment, I realized Evelyn hadn't been protecting me from her past. She had been protecting me from a man who had just started moving again. I drove back to Blackthorn Manor with the intake file burned into my memory. Evelyn Hart. High risk, credible threat, reputational attack pending. The trees along the highway blurred into gray streaks, but my mind replayed the director's words with clinical precision. Powerful men rewrite narratives. They call their wives unstable. They make sure no one believes them. I did not feel betrayed. I felt ignorant. For 12 years, I had loved a woman whose most defining chapter I never read. When I stepped into the manor that evening, everything looked unchanged. The staff moved quietly through the hallways. Dinner had been prepared with careful symmetry. On the surface, nothing had shifted, but I saw it differently now. This house had sheltered a survivor. and I had never asked the right questions. Evelyn was in the sitting room, reading. She looked up when I entered, and I noticed it immediately, the tension in her shoulders before she smoothed it away. "You went north," she said, not as a question. "Yes." She closed the book carefully, marking her page as if she expected to return to it. "I suppose you saw," she added. I sat across from her, the firelight drawing quiet shadows across her face. "I saw enough to understand that I didn't understand you at all." She held my gaze, steady but braced. "You weren't supposed to carry it," she said. "That was the point. 12 years ago," I said slowly, "you told me you were traveling abroad to recover from exhaustion." A faint, almost bitter smile touched her lips. "That's what my publicist suggested." "So you weren't in Europe?" "No." The simplicity of the answer cut deeper than denial would have. I began reconstructing the timeline aloud, not accusing, just aligning facts. "You were engaged to Graham Whitlock," I said. "A financier with political reach." The engagement ended abruptly. Within months, there was a sealed legal dispute. "And then you disappeared." Her expression shifted at his name. Not panic. Not hatred. Recognition. "He didn't like being told no," she said quietly. I waited. "When I tried to end the engagement," she continued, "I made sure I looked unstable, emotional, ungrateful. He told people I was overwhelmed by the expectations of marrying into his world." Her voice remained controlled, but something colder lived beneath it. "He told his board members I was too sensitive to handle public life. He told donors I had anxiety. He told my own extended family that I needed rest." I felt something inside me tighten. "That's not a crime," I said carefully. "No," she agreed. "It's strategy." The word landed heavy. "He never had to touch me," she went on. "He just needed to isolate me, question my memory, reframe my reactions. If I raised my voice, I was hysterical. If I cried, I was unstable. If I withdrew, I was cold." She inhaled slowly. "And when I threatened to expose certain financial practices I'd discovered, he suggested I was confused, that I didn't understand the complexity of his work, that women like me should be grateful for protection." There it was. Not physical violence, but erasure. Racist undertones woven subtly through social circles that whispered she was too ethnic for certain boardrooms, too emotional for high finance, too fragile for leadership. "He told one senator's wife that I wasn't raised for this level of sophistication," she added, almost absently. That my background showed. My jaw hardened. "They attacked your character," I said. "They attacked my credibility," she corrected. I stood and walked to the window, needing space from the controlled calm in her voice. "I accessed archived court fragments," I admitted. "There was an investigation into coercion and intimidation. It dissolved," she said, "because nothing leaves bruises when it's psychological." I turned back to her. "You never told me." She looked at me then with something that resembled sorrow. "I watched you build your empire, Adrian. I watched how other men treated you when you threatened their influence. I saw how quickly they smiled in public and undermined you in private." Her eyes softened, but her words did not. "I couldn't risk being seen as damaged. Not in your world. Not beside your name." The assumption stung more than the secrecy. "You think I would have seen you as broken?" I asked. "I think," she said carefully, "that men raised in power sometimes don't recognize emotional imprisonment when it doesn't look like bruises." Silence filled the room. She wasn't wrong. I had been trained to detect financial fraud, land disputes, hostile takeovers. I had not been trained to detect reputational assassination dressed as concern. The sanctuary suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't charity. It was a lifeline, a system built to intercept the kind of social suffocation she survived. "I wasn't hiding from you," she added quietly. "I was protecting what we built. If he resurfaced, I wanted it contained. As if her past were toxic, I felt the weight settle into something sharper. Not suspicion. Responsibility. If Evelyn had endured a man capable of dismantling her credibility without lifting a hand, then that man had studied power the way I had. He would not disappear simply because she escaped, and powerful men rarely accept humiliation without recalculating. "I need to know something," I said finally. "As he contacted you recently?" She hesitated. Just long enough. Not directly, she replied. My pulse slowed instead of quickened. Indirect was worse. What does that mean? It means, she said, her voice steady but low, that 3 weeks ago, one of our foundation partners withdrew funding after receiving an anonymous briefing about my history of instability. The room felt smaller. He's testing the perimeter, she continued. He's reminding me that he can still rewrite the narrative. I understood then. This wasn't resurfacing. It was positioning. And if he was repositioning, it meant he had been watching. Later that night, as I reviewed my company's recent audit requests, I found his name attached to a regulatory inquiry filed just days earlier, proving he hadn't vanished at all. He had simply been waiting for the right moment to strike. Graham Whitlock. The name no longer felt like a fragment from Evelyn's past. It felt present. Active. I sat alone in my study long after midnight, screens lit, the documents open, patterns aligning in a way I could no longer dismiss as coincidence. Whitlock was a titan in private equity, hostile acquisitions, silent board takeovers, philanthropic donations placed with surgical precision. His public image was immaculate. Awards, university endowments, diversity panels where he spoke about opportunity with measured humility. But men obsessed with control rarely forgive humiliation, and Evelyn had humiliated him publicly by ending their engagement. In elite circles, broken engagements were not romantic footnotes. They were power statements. A woman walking away from a man like Whitlock was not seen as brave. She was seen as reckless, ungrateful, disloyal opportunity. I began tracing political contributions through federal databases and private disclosures. It did not take long to see the pattern. Campaign donations routed to candidates who had consistently voted against maritime subsidies that benefited my shipping subsidiaries. Board appointments quietly influenced to block zoning expansions near our main property. Anonymous regulatory audits launched into Caldwell Logistics within weeks of Whitlock's investment firm acquiring minority stakes in adjacent ports. Subtle warfare, not explosive. Not obvious, strategic. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. He had not pursued Evelyn after she entered the sanctuary. He had pursued leverage instead. Influence, networks, debt. And when she married into my name, he adjusted his aim. He attacked me, not directly, systematically. I thought about the audit notices that had irritated me months ago. The tax compliance rumor that surfaced in a financial blog that questioning whether inherited estates like mine benefited from old money loopholes. The foundation partner who withdrew funding after receiving anonymous concerns about my wife's emotional stability. At the time, I treated them as the cost of visibility. Now they looked like fingerprints. Evelyn must have recognized them long before I did, which meant she had been protecting me by staying silent. The realization unsettled me more than anger would have. The terrifying secret was not that she survived a manipulative engagement. It was that she believed I would choose my legacy over her truth. I stood and walked to the window, though looking out at the dark stretch of lawn illuminated by low garden lights. This estate had been defended for generations. My father taught me to guard it like territory, protect the name, preserve the value. But no one had trained me to defend a woman from narrative assassination. My phone vibrated on the desk. An email from our chief legal officer. Subject: informal inquiry, shipping compliance review. Attached was a preliminary notice of federal interest in Caldwell Maritime's fuel reporting practices. Minor discrepancies. Routine on the surface. Except the referral source was listed as a private financial oversight consultant. Whitlock Advisory Group. He wasn't hiding anymore, he was escalating. I called my legal officer immediately. This inquiry, who initiated the review? I asked. It's unofficial, she replied carefully. But the advisory firm recommending scrutiny has ties to Whitlock's portfolio. And you're just telling me this now. We assumed it was competitive noise, she said. We didn't think it was personal. It was personal. After I ended the call, I found Evelyn standing in the doorway. I hadn't heard her approach, She said quietly, yes. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. No accusation in her tone. No panic. Only exhaustion. He doesn't need to win. she said. He just needs to exhaust you. I studied her face, the composure she wore like armor. You've been tracking this longer than I have. I learned how he operates, she answered. He isolates. He refrains. He lets other people do the dirty work while he stays above it. Why didn't you tell me? Her gaze didn't waver. Because if you confronted him too early, and he would escalate faster, and I needed time to build the sanctuary quietly. Time. She had been playing defense alone for over a decade. I don't need you to fight him, she added softly. I need you to survive him. The statement could have triggered pride, could have pushed me toward reckless retaliation. Instead, something colder settled inside me. Resolve. I was raised to defend land and lineage, I said slowly. But this isn't about land. No, she agreed. It's about perception. Whitlock specialized in dismantling men through reputation. He didn't need physical violence. He preferred boardrooms, whisper campaigns, subtle suggestions that someone was unstable or corrupt. Emotional damage inflicted through credibility. Evelyn had lived inside that machinery, and she believed I was unprepared for it. She underestimated me. Not because she doubted my intelligence, because she doubted my willingness to risk everything. I walked back to my desk and closed the audit notice. I won't confront him, I said. Her brows drew together slightly. Adrian, I won't confront him, I repeated. Not the way he expects. She searched my expression, trying to read what I wasn't saying. Then what will you do? I met her eyes, steady and deliberate. I'm going to let him believe he's still winning. Silence filled the space between us. And in that silence, a decision formed, quiet, irreversible, and far more dangerous than open war. Instead of confronting Evelyn or publicly challenging Whitlock, I began preparing a move so unexpected that when it finally unfolded, even she would question how far I was willing to go. I did not accuse Evelyn. I did not demand timelines or apologies or confessions wrapped in tears. I did not threaten separation to shield my name from association with scandal. If Whitlock expected panic, I would deny him the satisfaction. Instead, I moved quietly. The sanctuary's funding doubled the following week. The transfer was routed through a newly structured subsidiary to avoid immediate visibility. I approved additional operational reserves under disaster preparedness allocations. No press release, no announcement, just reinforcement. I hired private security consultants not for Blackthorn Manor, not for Caldwell Maritime, but for the facility in upstate New York. Their contracts were classified under risk mitigation expansion. 2 former federal threat analysts were assigned to review perimeter vulnerabilities and digital intrusion risks. Evelyn noticed none of it at first, or perhaps she noticed and chose not to question it. At dinner one evening, she studied me longer than usual. You've been working late, she said softly. There's been movement, I replied. There's always movement, not like this. I redirected 2 of my most trusted legal strategists to begin reviewing Whitlock's public filings not in aggression but in analysis. I wanted pressure points, not headlines. I wanted structural weaknesses, not emotional reactions. For months, I built a silent case. Shell companies tied to offshore holdings surfaced through layered tracing. Entities registered in the Cayman Islands linked indirectly to political action committees. Donations that appeared philanthropic on the surface but rerouted through consulting fees. Regulatory shortcuts guised as compliance adjustments. Former employees, bound by non-disclosure agreements, were quietly contacted through intermediaries. Some declined. Others hesitated. A few, after careful assurance of protection, spoke. He doesn't yell, one former analyst told my team during a secured interview. He questions your competence until you question it too. Another described internal diversity initiatives framed publicly as progressive while privately mocking candidates who didn't fit a particular cultural aesthetic. He'd say they weren't polished enough for that level of capital, she admitted. It was never explicit, but it was understood. Emotional damage disguised as mentorship. Reputational erosion disguised as performance feedback. I recognized the pattern. It mirrored what Evelyn described, control through narrative manipulation. This was not revenge, it was insulation. Every document I reviewed, Every testimony I secured had one objective: ensure Evelyn would never again feel hunted. One night, as I mapped offshore tax shelters across interconnected spreadsheets, a name surfaced repeatedly beside Whitlock's private equity venture senator Harold Reeves, chair of the Federal Commerce Oversight Committee, the same committee that had initiated informal inquiries into Caldwell Maritime. I stared at the screen longer than I intended. Whitlock wasn't merely corrupt. He was protected. Protected by elected officials who benefited from his campaign financing. Protected by regulatory heads who owed him favors. Protected by a system that valued stability over truth. Destroying him would not be clean. It would fracture alliances. It could trigger investigations into my own holdings as collateral damage. I closed the laptop and sat in the darkness of my office. For most of my life, reputation had been currency. It determined access, trust, expansion. Now it felt negotiable. Evelyn entered without knocking. She moved carefully, as if measuring the atmosphere. "I received a call today," she said. "From a foundation partner." She paused. "They said someone is asking detailed questions about our sanctuary funding. Questions framed as concern." Whitlock was probing. I stood slowly. "You're safe." "That's not what I asked." Her eyes searched mine sharper now. "What are you doing, Adrian?" There it was. She had noticed. "I'm stabilizing vulnerabilities," I answered. Her jaw tightened slightly. "You hired external security for the facility." So she had noticed. "Yes." "And you reassigned legal counsel from shipping to private equity compliance reviews." "Yes." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You're building something." "I'm removing something," I corrected. Fear flickered across her face, not fear of Whitlock. Fear of escalation. "He thrives on escalation," she said. "If he senses resistance, he widens the attack. He doesn't need to win publicly. He just needs to create doubt." "I'm not creating doubt," I replied calmly. "I'm collecting evidence." Her expression shifted, almost pained. "You don't understand," she whispered. "When powerful men feel exposed, they don't retreat. They retaliate. And they don't just target you. They target everyone connected to you." "I know," I said quietly. "Do you?" she pressed. "Because this won't stay contained in boardrooms. He'll leak stories. He'll question your ethics. He'll imply you're unstable for defending a wife with a history." The word history sounded like a slur. I stepped closer. "I am not defending your past," I said steadily. "I am dismantling his future." Silence. Her composure faltered for the first time since I had known her. "This is bigger than us," she said softly. "Yes," I agreed. "It always was." She searched my face, trying to measure how far I was willing to go. "You could lose standing," she warned. "Investors. Political allies. For the first time in my life." I answered. "Standing feels secondary." Her breath caught. And then, instead of relief, I saw something else settle into her eyes. Fear. Not of Whitlock. Of me. Because in that moment, Evelyn realized I was no longer playing defense, and she wasn't certain how much of our world would survive the offensive I had just set in motion. Evelyn discovered the expanded funding on a gray Tuesday morning. I knew the exact moment because she walked into my office holding a printed ledger in both hands, not crumpled, not shaken, just steady enough to reveal effort. "You doubled it," she said. There was no accusation in her tone, no raised voice, just quiet alarm. "Yes." "You rerouted it through disaster allocations." "Yes." Her composure had always been a textural, designed, reinforced, deliberate. But that morning, I watched a fracture form along the surface. "You hired external security," she continued. "2 former federal analysts." "Yes." She inhaled slowly, as if calibrating her reaction. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you would have tried to stop me." Her eyes met mine. Not angry. Afraid. That was when I understood the depth of it. This wasn't about gratitude or partnership. She feared escalation. "You don't know how he responds to pressure," she said quietly. "I know how he responds to exposure. That's not the same thing." Her voice lowered further. "When he feels cornered, he doesn't fight forward. He destabilizes." She stepped closer to my desk. "For years, I maintained distance. I avoided public accusations. I let him believe I was rebuilding quietly. Survival required invisibility, Adrian. That was the only way he lost interest. You think he lost interest? I asked. She hesitated. No, she admitted. I think he shifted focus. There it was. Adrian's strategy, my strategy, threatened the balance she had carefully preserved for over a decade. Silence had been her shield. I was dismantling it. I can't live by his rules, I said evenly. You might have to, she replied. The statement would have sounded weak from anyone else. From her, it sounded like strategy carved from trauma. I stood and walked around the desk so we were no longer divided by wood and authority. I went to the facility, I said. Her breath caught. I saw the intake file. Silence thickened. I know you live there, I continued. I know the engagement ended because you refused to be managed. I know he tried to frame you as unstable. She didn't interrupt. I expected tears. Instead, she straightened. I wasn't unstable, she said quietly. I know. I wasn't confused. I know. I wasn't hysterical. I know. The repetition wasn't for me. It was for the memory of rooms where she hadn't been believed. I did not demand details. I did not ask for confession or chronology. I said the only thing that mattered. Your history does not diminish your standing. It expands it. Her eyes flickered with something I had never seen directed at me before. Disbelief. Powerful men don't usually say that, she murmured. Powerful men don't usually marry you, I replied. That earned the faintest shadow of a smile. For the first time since this began, she allowed herself to speak, not dramatically, not theatrically. In controlled fragments, like someone placing fragile glass on a table one piece at a time. He isolated me socially, she said. Had host dinners and subtly correct my phrasing in front of investors. Make it sound educational. She swallowed. If I challenged him privately, he'd say I was misremembering the conversation, that I was emotional, that my background made me sensitive to criticism. Background. The word carried weight. She had grown up outside the generational wealth circles Whitlock moved in. Educated, refined, capable but not born into that ecosystem. He used it as leverage. He'd imply I wasn't raised for that level of sophistication, she continued. Not directly. Just enough that others would nod. Emotional damage delivered through suggestion. He controlled access to money, she added, not by refusing it, but by questioning my judgment when I wanted independence. Every decision became proof that I wasn't ready. And when you left, I asked softly. He initiated a narrative, she said. Briefed people privately. Said I was overwhelmed. Suggested I needed rest. By the time I entered the sanctuary, half the city believed I was recovering from a breakdown. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Did anyone defend you? I asked. She held my gaze. No, the word echoed. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. You're not invisible anymore. That's what frightens me. She whispered for a moment. The grandeur of Blackthorn Manor felt irrelevant. We were not lord and lady. We were two people standing in the aftermath of a long, quiet war. I'm not escalating blindly, I said. I'm building structure. Evidence. Protection. And when he senses that, she asked. He already has. I answered. Her eyes sharpened. What do you mean? Before I could respond, a knock echoed from the hallway below, firm, official, unfamiliar. We both turned toward the sound. Moments later, our chief of staff appeared at the doorway. Pale. There are federal investigators here, she said carefully. They're requesting access to financial records related to Caldwell Maritime. Evelyn's face rained of color. I understood instantly. Whitlock had sensed movement, and he had responded. As black government vehicles lined the gravel drive of Blackthorn Manor, I realized this was no longer a silent war, and the first public strike had just landed at our door. The first thing I noticed wasn't the investigators. It was the way Blackthorn Manor reacted to them. The staff moved with a different kind of silence, less practiced, more frightened. The gravel outside crunched under unfamiliar tires, and that sound alone felt like a violation. Men in dark coats stepped into my foyer with clipped professionalism, holding folders that carried the weight of federal language and implied guilt. Evelyn stood slightly behind me on the staircase landing. Not hidden, but not presented either. Her posture was straight, but I could feel the shift in her breathing. This was her nightmare-made physical authority arriving, not to protect, but to evaluate. One of the investigators introduced himself, offering his badge like a formality that required no acceptance. "Lord Caldwell," he said. The title sounded strange in his mouth, as if he was mocking it without intending to. "We're here regarding compliance inquiries tied to Caldwell Maritime and Associated Foundation transfers." Foundation. The word was chosen carefully. Not just my business, not just shipping. Her. I glanced back at Evelyn and saw the guilt returning to her face like a shadow reclaiming its place. "This is my fault," her eyes said without words. I refused to let her carry that. "Of course," I replied evenly, stepping forward. "You'll have full cooperation. My counsel will be present." The investigator's gaze shifted toward Evelyn for half a second, long enough to register her, short enough to pretend he hadn't. That subtle glance carried the kind of quiet prejudice I had spent my life pretending didn't exist in police circles. It wasn't overt. It was worse. Assessment disguised as neutrality. A question unspoken. Is she the problem? Evelyn noticed it too. Her chin lifted slightly, but her hands tightened at her sides. They took over my library the way storms take over coastlines without permission, without apology. Boxes of documents were requested. Financial records. Corporate logs. The foundation disbursements. Every page they handled seemed to rewrite who I was in their eyes, not a steward of legacy, but a potential suspect. Outside, the first reporter van arrived before noon. Then another. By sunset, the manor's gates were framed by cameras. The next morning, my name was already sliding through headlines. Kale dial supina facias fader el crdy, afuda ion fiandia fo namo s so urcs suji gest irargula abhias. Whitlock had made his move. Not with a lawsuit, not with a direct accusation. He had done what he did best, seeded suspicion, and let institutions do the damage. At breakfast, Evelyn barely touched her coffee. She sat with shoulders held too carefully, like she was trying not to take up space. "I should leave," she said suddenly. The words shocked me, not because they were irrational, but because they were familiar. It was the survival instinct she had been trained into. Disappear before you become a liability. I set my cup down slowly. No. Her eyes flicked up. "Adrienne, you're not leaving," I repeated, calmer, firmer. "Not because you're trapped here. Because you don't have to run anymore." She swallowed. "They're here because of me. They're here because Whitlock can't tolerate losing control," I said. "And because he thinks if he stains my name, he stains yours by proximity." Her voice dropped. "He's going to make them believe I'm unstable again." I leaned forward slightly, forcing her to meet my eyes. "He's going to try, and I'm going to make him fail." That afternoon, I activated the final stage of my strategy. I had spent months collecting evidence with the patience of a man who understood that truth without structure is just noise. Now I packaged it with precision: fraud trails, bribery patterns, falsified reporting, shell company maps, internal emails from Whitlock's firm, testimony transcripts from former employees, and financial linkages to political figures who had quietly shielded him. I delivered it in two directions at once: federal authorities, investigative journalists with reputations for not flinching, not because I wanted a spectacle. Because Whitlock understood only one language: exposure that he could not privately bury. For the first time since the investigators arrived, Evelyn's calm broke in a way that wasn't fear, it was disbelief. "You already had all of this," she whispered when I told her. "I didn't want to use it unless he forced my hand," I replied. Her voice trembled slightly, restrained but raw. "You were waiting." "I was preparing," I corrected. The twist came the next morning. A major outlet published a piece that didn't mention Caldwell Maritime at all. Not away from me completely. Institutions rarely admit they were used, but toward him with sudden urgency. Within days, Whitlock's empire began unraveling. His partners distanced themselves. Political allies released stiff statements about letting the process unfold. His charitable board seats quietly reassigned. His fund investors demanded emergency meetings. But the backlash hit me too. Caldwell stock valuations fluctuated violently. Friends who once laughed beside me at gala tables stopped returning calls. Invitations disappeared, not with direct rejection, but with vague scheduling conflicts. Even worse were the whispers. Some blamed me for dragging the whole system into chaos. Others blamed Evelyn. One headline quoted an anonymous source. Caldwell's wife has a complicated past. This may be about more than money. Complicated. That word was a polished weapon. I watched Evelyn read it on her phone, her face tightening as if she'd been slapped. The shame reflex returned, automatic and brutal. I ruined you, she murmured. I took the phone gently from her hands and set it aside. You didn't ruin me, I said. You revealed what was worth protecting. She stared at me as if she didn't recognize the man speaking. Because for the first time, I understood what true nobility required, not dominance, endurance. The indictment came faster than I expected. Multiple counts: financial fraud, obstruction, falsified reporting. As the case opened, additional victims emerged, women with stories that sounded different in detail but identical in structure. Careers undermined. Credibility destroyed. Lives collapsed under the weight of narratives engineered to erase them. The sanctuary, once hidden, gained legitimacy overnight. Donations surged. Journalists called it an underground lifeline. Politicians who had ignored it suddenly praised it publicly, as if they had always cared. Evelyn watched it all unfold with restrained disbelief. For over a decade, she had believed survival meant shrinking. I proved survival could also mean standing taller, but victory carried a cost. The Caldwell name would never again be untouchable. It would be contested, debated, questioned. The kind of purity old families cling to was gone. And when the investigators finally left my library, a senior agent paused at the door and said quietly, "You understand, Lord Caldwell, that your cooperation doesn't erase the stain. People will always wonder why you were close to it." Close to it, as if proximity to truth was contamination. I nodded once. Let them wonder. That night, Evelyn stood beside me on the balcony overlooking the dark grounds. "It's not over," she said softly. "No," I agreed. "It's not." Because I had one final decision to make, one that would either restore our privacy or permanently redefine my legacy. And as I opened the sealed envelope my attorneys had delivered that evening, I realized the choice ahead of me wasn't about wedlock anymore. It was about what kind of lord I was willing to become. The sealed envelope from my attorneys sat open on my desk long after Evelyn had gone to bed. Inside was a proposal drafted by 3 senior board members of the Caldwell Foundation. It was measured, strategic, and entirely predictable. They advised temporary distance, a restructuring of visible priorities, a quiet rebalancing toward neutral initiatives, education grants, infrastructure partnerships, anything that would stabilize brand confidence after months of public scrutiny. The subtext was clear. Return to safety. Let the scandal fade. Let society forget. I could have accepted it. Wealth would recover. Stock would stabilize. Invitations would resume. The Caldwell name would regain its polished distance from controversy. But something had shifted inside me during this war. For the first time, I saw legacy not as inheritance, but as choice. The next board meeting was tense before it began. Faces that once carried easy camaraderie now held calculation. One trustee cleared his throat carefully. "Adrian, the Foundation's association with certain narratives has created volatility." "Survivors," I corrected calmly. "Yes, of course, survivors. But politically, this is sensitive terrain." "Integrity often is," I replied. Another board member leaned forward. "If you quietly divest from the sanctuary and reposition the funds, the public memory will soften. People prefer stability to moral crusades, moral crusades." The phrase was meant to sound excessive. I folded my hands on the table. "I am not divesting," I said. "I am expanding." Silence. "Expanding," someone repeated. "The sanctuary will no longer operate as a hidden subsidiary," I continued. It will become the primary mission of the Caldwell Foundation." Shock does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like stillness. "You're attaching your family name," one trustee said slowly, "to allegations, trauma, coercion, to protection." I interrupted. "To restoration." They exchanged glances. I could almost hear the unspoken concerns. Donors will flee. Politicians will hesitate. The Caldwell name will lose its neutrality. Good. Power untested by moral courage is fragile, I said evenly. If our legacy cannot survive alignment with truth, it was never strong to begin with. The vote was contentious. 2 resigned within the week. 3 stayed reluctantly. The press release was drafted not with triumph, but clarity. The Caldwell Foundation would publicly integrate the sanctuary as its central initiative. Legal advocacy networks would be funded nationwide. Trauma-informed care centers expanded. Confidential relocation systems formalized. Financial independence programs designed specifically for survivors of reputational coercion and psychological control. When the announcement went live, elite circles reacted exactly as predicted. A man of my standing tying his family name to survivors of coercion and emotional abuse was seen as politically reckless. Editorial columns debated whether I had become activist rather than aristocrat. Some suggested Evelyn had influenced me beyond reason. Others implied I was overcompensating for proximity to scandal. Let them speculate. At the formal launch event, Blackthorn Manor did not look like it used to. The ballroom, once reserved for curated galas, held advocates, therapists, former residents of the sanctuary, and journalists who had once stood at our gates with suspicion. Evelyn stood beside me. Not silent, not ornamental architect. When she spoke, her voice did not tremble. For years, she said, addressing the room, survival meant invisibility. I believed silence was strength, but silence protects the wrong people. There was no dramatic confession, no tears for spectacle, only structure. She outlined expansion plans with strategic precision, referencing policy reform, regulatory advocacy, and survivor-led advisory boards. Her past was no longer a secret to bury. It was a blueprint. After the event, an older businessman approached me privately. "You're risking everything," he said. "The men in your position don't usually tether themselves to this kind of narrative." I met his gaze steadily. "Men in my position don't usually marry women like her," I replied. He didn't answer. Over the next year, the manor transformed in ways that unsettled tradition. One wing became administrative headquarters for the expanded foundation. Conference rooms replaced rarely used salons. Strategy sessions replaced ceremonial dinners. Blackthorn Manor was no longer a monument to inherited distance. It became a headquarters for restoration. The unexpected twist arrived months later, when a private letter reached my desk from a young woman in California. Though she had escaped a high-profile corporate marriage after reading about the sanctuary's expansion, she wrote that seeing a man of visible power publicly align himself with survivors made her believe she would not automatically be discredited. That letter mattered more than any stock recovery. One evening, as the sun set across the Vermont hills, Evelyn and I stood together on the terrace. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "I did." She studied me with a softness that held no fear this time. "I thought the most terrifying secret in our marriage would drive you away," she admitted. "It wasn't the secret that terrified me," I said. "It was the thought that you carried it alone. The Caldwell name would never again be untouchable. It would be associated with conflict, reform, and controversy, but it would also be associated with protection." I had not shocked society by staying married. I shocked them by redefining leadership within that marriage. I chose not to leave when confronted with terror. I chose to build. And in doing so, I dismantled the quiet expectation that men preserve image over integrity. Evelyn slipped her hand into mine not in dependence, but in partnership. For the first time since the investigators arrived at our gates, the air felt clear. Yet as I looked out across the land I had once believed was my greatest responsibility, I understood something else. This legacy would demand vigilance, because power does not disappear when exposed. It adapts. And as a new invitation from a congressional oversight committee arrived requesting my testimony on financial influence reform, I realized the next battle would not be fought in secrecy, but in public, under oath.